Because if you actually believe life begins at conception, if you truly fundamentally believe that, if you think that that is murder, then you have to be every bit as pissed off at IVF as you are at abortion. And that is about to be a very, very uncomfortable fact for Republicans. Hey guys, I'm Hannah Cox with Base Politics, and you're watching the Base Politics podcast. Welcome back to the show. I missed you guys last week. I was out traveling in LA during our normal show time. I have a big debate I was filming with the Jubilee Network that should be coming out soon. Very, very excited for you guys to see it. It was a great topic, so I'll keep you posted. If you like this episode, don't forget, like, comment, and subscribe. Also, you can check out others in the series. And also, I do want to make a few quick notes. In place of the show last week, I put up a video I had been keeping in my pocket for some time about my trip to the border, my takeaways, and even bringing some of the interviews back to you of people I got to meet and speak with while I was down there. And I just have to say, I was so pleasantly surprised and delighted by the conversation around it. I have been unabashedly pro-immigration, pro-immigrant for my entire life. That was never, ever a controversial stance on the right or just period up until 2016. Like when that whole stuff started, it really just took me out. It confused me as a capitalist. It confused me as a Christian. To this day, I find that anytime I talk about immigration, it quickly becomes one of the most emotionally charged conversations, often becomes very vile very quickly. People just really seem to come undone. It's like they can't actually approach this as a public policy conversation. It reminds me of trying to talk about abortion or other similar issues. It's just, it gets up here immediately. And so I put the episode out there, just kind of bracing myself for come what may. And I was pleasantly surprised. It's been so well received. I've gotten so many amazing DMs thanking me for the conversation, thanking the experts I brought in for weighing in, talking about how much more informed they felt after listening to those conversations. And even the comments on YouTube were positive, which, I mean, just in general, it's kind of a rarity. This place can be a little bit of a cesspool. One person named Nicholas said, "I was wondering when we would get this after seeing the signs of your trip down there a while back. Other figures have done their own pieces down there in recent months, but it's a breath of fresh air to have one I know I can trust." Thank you, Nicholas. That means a lot to me. I really try my very best to be nuanced and intellectually honest. And I hope that anything I am bringing you is always at the very least coming from a place where you can trust that I am being authentic and genuine and transparent in my findings, even if you disagree with me. Another person said, "Saw this posted on Twitter. I really like your tweets and views. Seems reasonable, defendable, and without emotional guilt." I just wish, and I know this is a bit of a utopia, I wish we could have most public policy discussions in that kind of context. I don't understand why people get so emotional. Now, I know, especially for a woman, I am not an emotional person whatsoever. And so I think I just do have a general sense of stoicism and facts are facts. Let's just look at the facts and figure it out. I understand not everybody approaches matters in that way, but I just feel like on issues like this, where it is so personal to people, it would really behoove everyone to take the temperature down a notch and actually try to hear what other people are saying. Another person weighed in and said, "Well done. Nuance, separation of complex issues into discrete elements deserving different conclusions. Emphasis towards data and distinguishing opinion from data. Deeply researched, seeking, understanding contrarian perspectives, long-form media for decent context and data, principle-based, whole picture framing, and opinion analysis. I wish this sort of journalism was less rare. Thank you." He went on to say, "Wide gates, tall fences," which is a slogan that one of my guests explained on the episode. If you haven't checked it out yet, please go back and watch it. But he said that he liked this concept. He found it was excellent. "Open arms, but organized and careful. Immigrants made and make America great." Yes, they have. "The key to human flourishing, innovation, progress is more motivated minds, and none are more motivated than immigrants." This was just so refreshing to see. I feel like a proud mom when I go to my comment sections and see my audience responding like this. And I really think there's a lot of people out here like this. They're ready for actual solutions. They want to be practical. They have valid concerns, but they're willing to listen to the other side and come up with solutions together. Unfortunately, it seems most of those people are not in Congress. One of our jokers of a senator took to Twitter over the weekend, JD Vance, and said, "Not having 20 million illegal aliens who need to be housed, often at public expense, will absolutely make housing more affordable for American citizens." And he was responding to somebody who was mocking a person that just said that he was sick of the Biden administration, he was sick of the interest rates, he was ready for housing prices to come down, he felt he should be able to afford a home at age 23, and he was feeling frustrated. Somebody had weighed in on that comment and said, how will Trump's policies make it easier for this guy to buy a house? He has no answer. It's just mortgage rates were low under Trump and they're higher under Biden. Therefore, Trump will bring mortgage rates down. It's magical thinking. Now, yes, that is magical thinking. Interest rates went up because the Federal Reserve is desperately trying to get a hold of the mess they created with Congress's help in 2020 and 2021. They printed way too many dollars. They spent way too much money. Inflation was skyrocketing. The only way to try to right the ship was to raise interest rates. And so the idea that a new president coming in will automatically make the interest rates go down again, it's just not really reality. The interest rates will go down when they feel like they have gotten inflation successfully under control. Now, that's not to say that there are not real policy solutions and changes that could be made in order to ensure more people could afford housing. There are, and I've covered them on the show. I hope you go back and watch former episodes. But amongst those policy solutions, getting rid of 20 million immigrants is not one of them. As I and many other people pointed out to JD Vance on Twitter, that would actually make the price of housing skyrocket. Now, in response to stating obvious facts, there were a lot of snowflakes that came absolutely undone in response to me and others on Twitter when the simple fact was stated. It's just really weird to watch adults, particularly adult men, have meltdowns like this. Because it's actually just an inarguable fact that this is so. You might still support this kind of policy, but you have to do so in acknowledging that it would make everything more expensive. Immigrants are essential participants in many of our industries, construction being one of them. And it's phenomenal to me that people can look you straight in the face, complain about the price of housing, and then think deporting 20 million immigrants would have no impact on it whatsoever, or would even make it better. Like literally, this guy went to Yale, was it? And he still doesn't understand basic supply demand? Make it make sense. Let's look at the actual data around this. Immigrants make up a significant portion of the construction labor force in the U.S. As of recent data, about 30% of construction workers in the U.S. are foreign-born. In some states with high construction activity, such as California, Texas, and New York, the percentage of immigrant workers in the construction industry is even higher, sometimes exceeding 40%. Immigrant workers are present at all levels of the construction industry, from laborers to skilled tradespeople. They often fill essential roles in masonry, carpentry, drywall installation, roofing, and painting. Many immigrants have specific skill sets and experiences that are crucial for specialized construction tasks. For example, Latin American immigrants often have extensive expertise in masonry and tile work. Furthermore, the construction industry relies heavily on immigrant labor to maintain productivity and keep housing projects on schedule. Labor shortages in the construction sector are a recurring issue, and immigrant workers help bridge this gap. By filling labor shortages, immigrant workers help prevent delays in construction projects, which can have a ripple effect on housing prices and availability. Obviously, there are regional variations to this, but again, notably in areas that need to build the most amount of housing and other construction projects, they are vastly dependent on immigrant workers. And additionally, it's worth knowing in the aftermath of natural disasters such as hurricanes in the Gulf Coast, immigrant labor has been crucial in rebuilding efforts. It really shouldn't be hard to know this. And in response to stating these obvious facts on Twitter, I saw a number of people saying, Americans are doing these jobs. Americans would do these jobs. No, Americans largely won't do these jobs. And all you have to do is run a business to know that, or at least go talk to somebody who has run a business. We are fastly approaching a labor shortage in this country, which is very, very bad. Having high unemployment is bad for the economy, but actually having full labor is pretty much equally bad. When companies can't get workers, everything slows down, productivity decreases, they are able to make less money. Therefore, there's less jobs being created in the long run. When companies can't get enough workers, they have to slow down production. That places a lag on the entire economy. It's not good for anybody. So yes, you need to be able to hire immigrants. And if companies are not able to do so, the prices you are having to pay will skyrocket because there will be less supply for the demand. This is economics 101. And yet I have to restate it literally every episode. When demagogues like JD Vance try to claim that immigrants are coming in and taking from Americans, it also ignores other economic realities. Economic study after economic study after economic study shows that immigrants are a net positive impact on an economy. Yes, they come in and take jobs, but in the process, that creates more jobs. Yes, they may take up some housing, but in the process, they are building more housing. There is a ripple effect throughout every economy with the more people you add. As long as you're in a capitalist system, that means more work is getting done. That means there is greater economic impact. That means there's more jobs. That means there's more supply. That means prices come down. But I want you to look at some of the comments I got melting down for me reminding JD Vance of these basic economic realities. Teddy Ruskin said, Americans could start contracting businesses and grow them if they weren't undercut by cheap illegal labor. I mean, number one, Americans could start those businesses now. They actually aren't being undercut by cheap immigration labor. And you want to know why? Well, if you listen to the podcast episode I posted last week, you would have heard why, which is that the Biden administration is setting the prices for American employers on immigrant labor very, very high. The problem is not that Americans are being undercut, it's that they're being outworked. Americans will not take these jobs at large. And yes, it's better in construction than it is in industries like the food industry, but there is still a significant shortage. 30 to 40% of the workforce being immigrant is not insignificant. Do you think a bunch of Americans are just going to pop out tomorrow excited to do these jobs? No. If they were willing to do these jobs, if they were actively applying, most employers would pick them simply because it's easier to hire American laborers. But let's say this guy's premise is right, okay? Let's give him the benefit of the doubt for just a second. Let's say that Americans are just being completely outpaced due to cheap illegal labor. And if we got rid of that cheap illegal labor, then Americans could create companies that were profitable. But what does that mean? What does that mean? That means that they would have to charge more for houses, right? You get that? Because if you're going to have to pay more for labor, then you're going to have to pass those costs on to the consumer. So as I said, the price of housing would skyrocket. It always amazes me how these guys think they're mic dropping, and really they're just showing that they're completely economically illiterate. Evbot said there are plenty of Americans that would do the work. Where's that proof of concept, my dude? You clearly have not run a business. It is so vastly easy to tell who has ever been an employer and who has not. Because no, there's not just this proliferation of Americans hungry to work. Americans as a whole are worse workers. It's harder to get the same amount of output out of them when you do hire them. And as a whole, there are a vast number of jobs they are simply unwilling to do. And that's largely because we have built out a welfare system that enables them to not have to. And contrary to populist belief, immigrants cannot get welfare. They can't access welfare until they've been a citizen for 5 years. And so they don't have the same safety net, thus they work harder, which is why the welfare system needs to be gutted. But that's for another day. Some of the other pushbacks are just so indicative of horseshoe theory taking over on the right. I've said this over and over again, but if you go far enough left, you go far enough right, you end up in the same place. And literally, that is what is happening when you look at the MAGA nationalist populist wing of the GOP. Their economics are literally inseparable from those of people like Elizabeth Warren. This guy says a business that requires labor below the market clearing price is a failed business that would in normal circumstances disappear. That's not exactly right. One, because we have the government setting arbitrary levels for what the market clearing price is. The true minimum wage is 0, and past that, wages should be determined based on the amount of value that one is creating. Secondarily, when you look at something like housing, the costs for building housing are also not really a free market capitalist landscape. The government has intervened in this market so heavily, it's made it so expensive and arduous to build that I don't know how you could with a straight face even say that we're operating in a capitalist system in that market. So his premise is wrong, but furthermore, the notion that businesses shouldn't exist unless they can pay some arbitrary amount to their workers is asinine. That's Elizabeth Warren economics. Businesses should pay for labor based on the value they create. Period. And if the value created in that role is not a living wage, then that shouldn't be your full-time job. But there are plenty of businesses that can and should and do exist and that improve the quality of life for consumers without creating enough value in order to pay people full-time salaries. Another guy, Sal Monella, said the exploitation of cheap foreign labor at the direct expense of America's middle class and the American worker is the current model for home construction. Do you hear it? Do you hear the AOC slipping out? Now with this sect on the right, paying people a wage they are literally willing to risk their lives to travel and obtain is now exploitation. As I said in this tweet, these people are literally Elizabeth Warren in a Walmart suit. Dr. Swall weighed in and said tough national immigration laws would bring the issue to a head and we could reform immigration laws, but not until people are made to realize the extent of the labor problem. And I actually agreed. I said they'll realize it when they're all pushed into poverty and our food sources are all shipped overseas, it seems. Because I really don't know what else is going to wake these people up. Their head is so deep down in the sand. They are so far removed from economic realities that I feel, unfortunately, they will not recognize the folly in their politics until they are completely screwed over, until they can't afford crap, until their food is all being manufactured overseas, which is not only an economic problem, it's a national security one. But really, they're just like the people who live in deep blue democratic cities, and they're like, I just can't believe how bad crime has gotten and how expensive everything is, and like, who could be responsible for this? You are. Your bad beliefs are bankrupting you, and you don't wake up to it. You're the bad guy. You're the culprit in your own life. That's these people. Anyways, I'll wrap this up now. I just wanted to touch on this whole conversation since I was not actively present last week to weigh in. If you haven't gotten to watch that video yet, I encourage you to go back and view it. Let me know your thoughts. And also don't forget to check out my original episode of the Base Politics podcast from like 2-3 years ago. I did an entire deep dive on America's history around immigration, on the economic inputs that impact it, and on why I believe that you cannot have a capitalist system without an open immigration system. I'll link both of those in the show notes. But anyways, on to our actual first segment of the day. We have to talk about what happened over the past week around IVF, in vitro fertilization treatments. Let's roll this clip.
Landmark vote today in the Senate on access to in vitro fertilization. The legislation would protect the treatment nationwide at a time, as you know, it's come under fire from conservative groups. That includes Southern Baptists who just made their own decision on IVF. It's a divisive issue, to be sure, among its members. Lilia Luciano was at the Southern Baptist Convention.
Senators are poised for a historic vote today on a Democratic-led package that would protect in vitro fertilization as a nationwide right.
I had my daughters through IVF, and I think that anybody that wants to start a family should have the ability to start a family.
Senator Tammy Duckworth co-sponsored the bill.
So it doesn't force anybody to access reproductive technology. That just says if you want to do that, you can offer it, you can seek it, you can cover it.
Republicans also voiced their support for IVF in a different bill.
To the best of my knowledge, all 100 senators in this body support IVF. This should be a measure that transcends political divides.
CBS News polling reflects that sentiment, with an overwhelming majority of Americans saying IVF should be legal across party lines. But earlier this year, the Alabama Supreme Court ruled that frozen embryos are human beings and have the same rights as living persons. In response, the state then passed a law shielding IVF providers that discard embryos from prosecution and lawsuits.
The ayes have it, and the resolution is adopted.
Today's Senate vote comes just a day after the Southern Baptist Convention, the nation's largest group of Protestant Christians, passed a resolution opposing IVF.
We need to be very clear that human life begins at conception.
The resolution states the IVF process most often engages in the destruction of embryonic human life and encouraged its congregation of nearly 13 million to seek adoption and consider the ethical implications of IVF.
Just dealing with our infertility, it leaves a wound.
Southern Baptists Meredith and Zachary Sahadik already have one child through IVF. Another is on the way, also through the procedure.
I am for the sanctity of life and for the sanctity of embryos. I am against the idea that this technology is so wicked that it cannot be employed.
At the church's annual meeting Wednesday, Zachary got emotional speaking about his own experience.
And I have 10 embryos that I love, and with every bit of my being, we will have or see born into a Christian family.
The Sahadiks plan to use their remaining embryos for their own family or put the frozen embryos up for adoption.
When the resolution is adopted, what do you fear that means, or what are you concerned?
Really confident that we made a decision, sought prayer, sought wise counsel, so I'm not too scared.
And the Roman Catholic Church, which is the largest of any religious group in the country, is also against IVF. But as the action shows on the Hill, this very personal decision is going to continue being a major part of the political conversation.
It is such a personal decision.
Yeah.
But for some families, that's the only way they can have
The only
it.
option,
So
right?
many, for so many. People are delaying having children for many reasons.
Exactly.
And now many people are resorting to IVF for that.
The politics are so fascinating because organizations and groups and leaders who are so pro-family are not necessarily pro-this, which is the way that many people are able to have a family.
Yeah.
It could be, I think, the reason Democrats in the Senate are pushing it is because it can divide some members of the Republican Party, particularly Republican voters.
Perhaps. And what this couple told me is, look, I think there's a lot of misinformation. I don't think people understand the process or the possibility of donating a frozen embryo to another family.
Yeah, we know we don't want this politicized, that's for sure.
Oh, we're there. We're there.
But it happens.
Yeah. Lilia, thank you very much.
I love that he says we don't want this politicized. Like, my dude, it is too late for that. Now, full disclosure, guys, I decided to talk about this because I've gotten a lot of DMs. And for those of you who are newer to me on YouTube, who don't follow me elsewhere, I am a Southern Baptist preacher's kid. I grew up in this denomination. My dad is not only a pastor, he also taught for a number of years at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. And my parents were actually at this convention a couple weeks ago in Indianapolis, so they were there for the action. I actually didn't ask them how they voted, but I think they're pro-IVF, for the record. Now, I want to make a distinguishment before we dig in, because I am not Southern Baptist. I do not personally hold the views I'm about to discuss, but I am intrinsically familiar with them. And what I will say is, based on the theology of Southern Baptists and anybody else who claims that life begins at conception, this is the right vote. And that is about to be a very, very uncomfortable fact for Republicans. In case you did not grow up religious like I did, a couple facts you need to know around this. One, Southern Baptists are a very, very large entity that looms even larger in American politics. As they said in that news clips, Catholics are the largest denomination in the country, but Southern Baptists are the largest Protestant denomination. I know this is going to be really weird for any of you who are Catholic or just not religious, but Christians, and I mean Protestant evangelical Christians, do not consider Catholics Christians, okay? There's like this huge divide that I think if you're outside of the world of religion, you don't know about. I remember one time I dated a guy who was Catholic, and he was shocked to find out that my family did not consider him saved or Christian, but that is how it is. So just to be clear, Southern Baptists and Catholics are not the same, but they do hold pretty similar views around pro-life issues. Now, the Catholic Church even takes it a step further. If you really get into traditional Catholicism, they don't even believe in contraception. And so obviously the Catholic Church has been out there against IVF and all forms of abortion for many, many decades. I would say that most Christian denominations have not had as hardline of a stance on these matters. They have had similar hardline stances on abortion. Most would say life begins at conception. Abortion should be illegal in most circumstances. But I haven't really seen them weigh in on contraception. And up until recently, IVF has kind of just been like on the back burner. It wasn't really even acknowledged as being a part of this conversation. But clearly that's been stewing for some time behind the scenes. Oftentimes when you have a political movement, they recognize that they have to be pragmatic and they have to take things one step at a time. So obviously for a lot of these pro-life groups for many, many decades, the goal was to overturn Roe v. Wade. Did they have other agendas downline from that? Absolutely they did, as we've seen being put in place in a number of states since that ruling happened. They didn't leave with that, because those ideas, those policies were not nearly as palatable. Don't kill babies, that's an easy message to sell. You can't have a baby if you're struggling with fertility issues. Not as many people are going to take that bite. But now that they've gotten their way, they're feeling emboldened, and thus you're seeing things like the Alabama Supreme Court decision recently, and now motions like this. I asked ChatGPT to run some numbers, and it's worth knowing that they said about 61 million people in America are Catholics and another 14 million are Southern Baptist. Obviously, not everybody who is a part of these denominations follows their rules hook, line, and sinker, but still, we're talking about close to 80 million Americans who are technically under a belief system now that thinks IVF should not be legal for most people. Secondarily, it's worth knowing just how many Republican politicians are Southern Baptists themselves. We can never say hardline numbers because they don't actually have to report this, I guess. But the best estimates I found were at least 10 to 20% of Republican politicians are Southern Baptists. And I do know that we ran some data in Tennessee with a think tank I used to work for a number of years ago. And within that state legislature, we were able to say hard numbers. And I think it was 77% of the state legislature was Southern Baptist. Now, the Southern Baptists are actually headquartered in Nashville, so that might have had some impact. But still, we found the Southern Baptists to be a very powerful lobbying entity. What happened at the Southern Baptist Convention a couple of weeks ago was not only the movement in large part deciding that IVF was something they should not support in most circumstances, the motion went on to say that people should start pushing their state governments to intervene and ban it. Now, national Republicans are terrified of this push. They understand that this is an extremist fringe position. They are running away from it as fast as they can. And many of them actually went into damage control mode months ago after the Alabama Supreme Court ruling before this motion at the Southern Baptist Convention. Here's Ted Cruz in May saying Democrats are trying to scare voters into thinking that Republicans want to ban IVF, because a lot of them do. He says that is absolutely not true. I introduced legislation with Senator Katie Britt, she's from Alabama, to protect IVF at the federal level. Get the facts. Side note, why does Ted Cruz constantly post like he is a high school girl from 1996? I can't with him. Here's Senator Katie Britt herself weighing in. She says proud to join Senator Ted Cruz and all members of the Senate GOP in supporting continued nationwide access to IVF. And she put a screenshot showing all of their signatures. Here's Nikki Haley on Twitter saying IVF is pro-life. My children are blessings because of fertility procedures. Many parents would love to have children. We should not be banning these procedures. We should be encouraging them. Now, to be clear, I don't think the vast majority of Republicans, certainly not at the national level, are actually trying to ban IVF. But I do think there is a push within the GOP to do so, and I think it could gain traction. This is not a nothing burger. But for politicians like Katie Britt and Ted Cruz, while I think they're not actively trying to ban IVF, I do think they're big old hypocrites. Because the two of them, along with many, many others in the Senate GOP and down ranks, because the two of them, along with many, many others in the Senate GOP and down ranks throughout the party, have expressed over and over and over that they believe life begins at conception. Here's Ted Cruz in 2012. We need to be unequivocal in protecting life from the moment of conception until natural death. Here he is again in 2017. Each life is a gift from God, encouraged to see the House recognize that life begins at conception. Now, when I first started putting this episode together, I thought it would probably be pretty easy to find many, many tweets from many Republican politicians saying similar things. But as I began searching, something very odd was happening. Almost every single one of them, when I did a search on their Twitter feeds, had 0 tweets talking about conception at all. And at first I felt kind of gaslit by it. I was like, maybe I'm imagining this and all of these people have not said over and over and over and over and over for years that life begins at conception. I've just been living in a fever dream. But then as I kept going and the numbers just kept coming back, person after person after person with 0 history talking about this, I thought, this is getting weird. Maybe I exaggerated the numbers, but it certainly wasn't none of them. And as I kept digging, I realized I wasn't the only one noticing that these people had apparently scrubbed their feeds from this term. An account named Liz Charbonnet said more and more people are talking about why Katie Britt deleted her issues page where she says life begins at conception. This was on March 7th, shortly after the Alabama Supreme Court decision. In May 2022, her campaign website flat out said so. It said, as a Christian wife and mother, I am 100% unapologetically pro-life because of my faith and deeply held family values. Britt's website stated this at the time per an archived image of it. It went on to say, however, my belief in the science also reinforces my unwavering views on the issue as there is no doubt that life begins at conception. Every life is a sacred gift from God, and I am passionately committed to protecting the unborn. It's not clear when the language disappeared, but as of February 16th, 2024, Britt's website had been changed and said only, we must protect the sanctity of life. That starts with putting our children first. By March 5th, even that language was gone. Instead, it just featured Britt's photo next to an article about her strong support for IVF. But fortunately, while websites and Twitter feeds can be scrubbed, the internet is forever. And I managed to find an old video clip of her saying just that.
I'm Katie Britt. As a pro-life mother of 2, I know that life begins at conception. It's God-given and must be protected. That's why I fought to put President Trump's pro-life justices on the Supreme Court. As Alabama Senator, I will protect the sanctity of life and defund abortion providers. I will always defend our Christian, conservative, pro-life values and never apologize for it. I'm Katie Britt, and I approve this message.
What a big fat hypocrite. I know politicians are seedy. I know that they change their positions with the wind. I get that. But just watching it play out in real life is infuriating, especially because these are the same people that have been coming in and stripping women of the ability to get basic medical care across this country for the past year. And now they want to gaslight you and pretend that they never had these hardline extreme stances. And that's not because their views have changed. That's not because there's nuance. It's because they are liars. Because if you actually believe life begins at conception, if you truly fundamentally believe that, if you think that that is murder, then you have to be every bit as pissed off at IVF as you are at abortion. There is no gray area here because the vast majority of IVF involves the destruction of fertilized embryos. The doctors are selecting for the healthiest embryos to implant in somebody. Those that are less viable or genetically abnormal usually get discarded. Other embryos don't develop as properly and thus are also destroyed in the process in the lab. And additionally, many couples, once they have success with an embryo or two, decide that they don't want to use the rest of their embryos, and those either get frozen or destroyed. Now, there is a growing movement to try to help couples who have strong pro-life views put their embryos up for adoption. I tried to do some digging into this. I think clearly that is a viable, loophole if you hold this view. But what I can't really ascertain is just how common it is that there's a lot of demand for that. Thus far in my research, it kind of seemed like something clinics are telling people to make them feel better about going through the process, but I didn't really see any hardline data saying like X percentage of embryos that aren't wanted are adopted. And even without that, again, just by nature of the process itself, a lot of embryos get destroyed, even unintentionally. Again, I just want to emphasize that I in no way hold these views. I do not believe life begins at conception. And I think holding that viewpoint leads to really extreme, horrible outcomes. It's worth knowing, though, that it's not really a fringe viewpoint. According to a Gallup poll in 2019, about 42% of Americans said that they believe life begins at conception. And then another survey from the Pew Research Center found that people who are religious are more likely to hold these views, but among white evangelical Protestants, it's about 57% that believe this. And that's fine. I think that these matters are extremely personal. It's very difficult to gauge exactly when life begins. People obviously hold very different viewpoints. For me, I think that's somewhere in the first trimester once you have a heartbeat and an actual baby versus just a clump of cells. But I at least respect people who do hold this hardline view and are at the very least consistent, which is none of these politicians. The Southern Baptists and the Catholics are absolutely right in saying that if you believe life begins at conception, you should mostly oppose IVF. What you can't do is oppose all abortion, be totally fine with the government coming in and making sure that women can't get basic medical procedures, even when they are not really seeking to have an abortion, but are having a miscarriage or other issues happening with their pregnancy. You don't get to come in and then act like you are raw for IVF and you're pro-family and you wouldn't want to regulate people's bodies and choices like that. Sit down. These people are absolute hypocrites and it should make you mad. And to be clear, I do think that when we get out like the political ranks, right, we're talking about normal people, grassroots people, there is a problem. And I would like for more people to examine themselves in this regard. There's a problem in this country where a lot of people don't think past their knee-jerk reactions. They hold policy views, they hold political views that are either handed to them by their church or by their political party, and they don't think about the step 2, step 3 outcomes of holding those beliefs. They don't think about what that looks like in practice. They don't think about situations where maybe that view isn't as right or wrong. And I think this is one of them. I think the urge to protect babies in the womb is valid. It makes sense. And I think, like most Americans, I would be totally fine with some restrictions around it. For me, that would be around like 15 weeks or so. And I still think you would need to have very, very, very stringent protections for the health and safety of the mother. But a lot of people have been way too fine with sweeping regulations in this area and giving government a ton of power. And they were willing to do that because the outcomes of their beliefs weren't impacting them yet. They weren't impacting them yet. And that's so often what you see. People have really bad ideas. They're fine with imposing them on other people because they think it's not going to hurt them. It's not going to hurt them or people they love or people in their family. And so they don't have an issue with it. And then all of a sudden, there's a legal precedent set. And all of a sudden, that big government power can be wielded against them. And they're like, whoa, wait, I didn't see that coming. I didn't see that happening. I didn't mean for that. Well, you should have. You should have. If you had these hardline views on abortion, you should have seen this being the next logical step in the pro-life movement, going for IVF. And if you are somebody who's stringently anti-abortion, you oppose abortion in all instances, but you feel like this is too far, that IVF should be legal and people should be able to access it, then you need to really examine yourself. Because if you truly believe that life begins at conception, you truly believe any fertilized embryo being discarded is murder, then you should be absolutely as outraged at IVF as you are at abortion. You should be picketing at IVF clinics. And if you're not, then I don't think you actually believe life begins at conception. I think you just don't want women to have access to medical care. Personally, while I think being anti-IVF is a very, very extreme public policy position, I'm kind of happy this is happening because I think people need to be confronted with the extremes of their belief systems and hopefully back off of them. Hopefully recognize that there's nuance, that there needs to be room for individuals to make the best decisions for them, and that those decisions should mostly land between them and their doctors. I think most people who are anti-abortion believe that that issue will never touch them. They think I would never have an abortion. My kids would never have an abortion. Newsflash. A lot of people have had abortions. They're just not telling you. But they're able to be very removed from that and from the fallout of those policy positions because they don't think they know people who are impacted by it. IVF is not going to be the same. A lot of Americans are accessing IVF. And in fact, many of the pastors and the people who were at the Southern Baptist Convention expressed their dismay at having to go back and tell their congregations, many of which had people within them who've had IVF, that all of a sudden they're sinners, right? Because pastors don't like telling the people in their pews that they're sinners. They like talking about all the people outside their doors as sinners. That makes the people in the pews feel really good about themselves. It's very rare that you see it actually targeted towards them. That's why they talk a lot more about homosexuality and abortion than they do about cheating on your wife or being a glutton. I think if you see these kinds of policies starting to progress, if you recognize these belief systems creeping into the places you inhabit, maybe check your premises, maybe check your belief system, and maybe don't be so quick to give the government power over other people, because it always will end up being wielded against you eventually. All right, guys. Well, now that we've talked about women's bodies, I think it will be a nice transition to talk about men's bodies. Over the past week or so, news circulated, especially on platforms like TikTok, that the U.S. would be re-implementing a draft. And people had a lot of thoughts. I'll start with this one.
So my entire For You page right now is men getting on the internet, screaming, crying, throwing up because of this war draft that is going into effect for men ages 18 to 26. And so I'd like to take us back a little bit to when women were getting on the internet and we were screaming, crying, throwing up because Roe v. Wade was overturned. And then we've been progressively losing more rights over our bodies, and to the point now that they're going after contraceptives. And so I just wanted to pose a question into this dialogue and ask that it really sucks when the government wants to force you to do things with your body that you don't want to do, doesn't it? It really sucks when the government sneak passes legislation when your bodies are on the line, doesn't it? And you might say, Haley, this is war, this is different. Either way, lives are being lost. It's just the difference is your deaths will be seen as honorable and heroic, while ours is just seen as a side effect of being a woman.
I really like her framing, honestly. She kind of ate with that, but she's right. Listen, I think if there's one takeaway you should have in looking at the activities of the U.S. government over the past century or so, it should be that the U.S. government should have zero say over what happens with your body. From forced medical trials, to slavery, to vaccine mandates, to the war on drugs, to now abortion issues and the draft. It is completely screwed up and unethical that any government has a say over your body. That should make you very uneasy. And she's right. Men have been very pressed as this conversation has been circulating. It's been, I guess, kind of interesting because the draft has not been implemented since the 1970s, but it's still there. Men have always had to register for it. It seems that when this news started circulating, many men just became re-aware of it. And I had a lot of men in my comments saying, if you're truly a feminist, then you should believe in conscription for women. No, I don't believe in conscription for anybody. Okay, that's the actual feminist position, because feminism is the belief in the equality of the sexes, and true feminists fight for human rights for women and men. And so no, feminism would not ever argue for both genders to be equally oppressed. It would fight for both to be free. Nobody should have to register for the draft. And I think if they ever do try to implement it, I hope that we see tons and tons of people resist. But I want to roll a quick video from a man who was weighing in on this conversation just so you can get a little bit of the conversation for yourself.
The U.S. government could be about to force 18 to 26-year-olds to go to war. As of a few days ago, the House of Representatives have passed a bill that allows the Selective Service to go through all the government databases and find any males between the ages of 18 and 26 in order to force them into military service if the government decides we need them to go and fight. Now, the real question here is not why did they do that, because you are required in the United States to be registered for this anyway.
He's not correct, and most of the men who are talking about this online are also not correct about what's happening. Let's get into the actual fact check of the segment. Started doing some digging because, again, this was all over social media. People believed this was happening. They were really up in arms. But as you'll see from this headline here, no, the U.S. didn't bring back the draft. And their post says, social media posts claiming the United States has reinstated the draft are false, possible misinterpretations of a suggested change to the nation's selective service system. The U.S. House of Representatives Friday passed a measure with the National Defense Authorization Act that would automatically enroll men 18 to 26 with the selective service system. The federal agency documents all people registered for selective service, many mandatorily. The agency would provide that information to the Defense Department in case of a draft, although one is not currently in place. A draft hasn't been instituted in the country since 1973, and enlisting in the service is voluntary. Men 18 to 25 are already required by law to register for selective service. As the law is written now, anyone who's required to register and fails to do so could be charged with a felony punishable by as many as 5 years in prison and a fine of $250,000. They went on to note that 2024 is the smallest active duty force since 1940. Findings from a Pew Research Center report suggest only 23% of young people would qualify for the military, and a majority of Americans aged 18 to 29 have a negative view of the armed forces altogether. Given the state of the military-industrial complex, it's hard to argue back against that. So men, for now, you are not being drafted, but for all of us, we need to continue fighting that this law is even on the books at all. And if they didn't have a guarantee of American lives, maybe people in Congress would rise up and actually do their job and quit letting the executive office get us into so many ridiculous wars. I say the executive office, but also it's like the Department of Defense, it's the military-industrial complex, it's the Pentagon. There's a lot of people with dirty hands, but Congress needs to rise up and stop them. All right, lastly, I have 2 short videos I want to show you for the week. The first is from our forgotten queen, I think, Condoleezza Rice. I don't know about you guys. I was a kid during the Bush administration. I remember Condoleezza Rice being around. I really didn't know much about her. I liked Bush just because I liked all generic Republicans as a kid growing up in the South. Obviously, my views on Bush have soured significantly over the years, but Condoleezza Rice seems to be a real one too. She just gave this statement recently while speaking at the Ronald Reagan Library, and it is definitely the most base thing I've heard all week.
So are you for school choice or not? We already have a choice system in education. If you are of means, you will move to a district where the schools are good and the houses are expensive, like Palo Alto, California. If you go across the street from Stanford, Palo Alto High has a performance arts center that looks like a smaller version of Stanford's. If you're really wealthy, you will send your kids to private schools. So who's stuck in failing neighborhood schools? Poor kids. A lot of them minority kids. So how can you say you're for civil rights? How can you say you're for the poor when you're condemning those children to not being able to read? By the time they're in 3rd grade, they're never going to read. So if you want to say that school choice and vouchers and charter schools are destroying the public schools, fine. You write that editorial in the Washington Post, but then don't send your kids to Sidwell Friends.
I love this. That was an actual mic drop because she's totally right. All of the people who oppose school choice only actually oppose school choice for poor kids. Most of them have their own kids in private schools, first and foremost. And as she points out, everybody else in America already has choice. Even the middle class, right? Middle class people will work really hard to get into a good neighborhood that has a decent public school. It's the people without means, without mobility, who are trapped in failing school systems. That not only has dire outcomes for the individual, it also has dire outcomes for families, for generations, and for communities. Education is essential for someone to get on the ladder for economic opportunity. There is zero excuse to oppose school choice at this point unless you are just literally a grifter who is profiting off the system. That's it. That's it. Inexcusable. And not only are you a grifter, but you're condemning poor kids to poverty and stripping them of their ability to move up because of your grift. I'm going to have to look more into Condoleezza Rice, but honestly, she feels like a feminine hero that we need right now because there are just so few adults in the room. On both the left and right, really. On both the left and right. But I guess I miss the lack of leadership, the sense of our leaders having character and merit on the right more than I do on the left, because to me, the left never really had it. Whereas as a kid, I really did feel like, we had people like Condoleezza Rice, who maybe I don't agree with on every public policy front, but who seemed genuine, who seemed to be people of moral, upstanding character, who seemed to genuinely care about Americans, and who had some understanding of the principles of a limited government and free market capitalism, which is just going so fast on the right, it should terrify you. Now, if you want an idea of what the current vacuum on the right looks like when it comes to the lack of leadership, the lack of moral character, the lack of good ideas, I want to show you this clip that I saw over the past couple of days from a Turning Point USA conference. For those of you who don't know, Turning Point USA is a grifter org. It's run by Charlie Kirk, and it gets millions and millions of dollars. It's one of the largest right-wing entities at this point. They don't accomplish anything. I don't think they even have a piece of legislation to their name. They mostly just hold these events for young people who also want to be grifters. I've been to one of them in the past. It was one of the most cringe experiences I've ever had. I don't understand how so many donors are getting duped. They give Charlie Kirk and this organization money because they think they're going to move young people right, when really it's just kind of a cult for weird kids who are already into college Republicans, and it's a huge turnoff to everybody else. I'm embarrassed. And anybody who's there should be embarrassed. And I cannot fathom how anybody thinks that this is going to recruit young people to the right. Furthermore, this is the same organization, and Charlie Kirk in particular, who will whine all day long about identity politics. He is high-key pissed there are black pilots, okay? He's been going off about this for over a month. He can't stand identity politics. He can't stand the thought that anybody might get hired for their race, even though he cannot prove that that's even what's happening with airline pilots. That's a whole other tangent. Anyways, they get so mad about identity politics. But tell me, what is this if not identity politics? White boy summer? White boy summer? I just truly, it's so cringe. It really is the same mentality I grew up with in the church, where they're a majority, right? They have the majority of seats of power. They have so many politicians in control. They are the largest demographic, and yet they feel like they are persecuted and victims, and they are constantly looking for a strong man to come in and pay them lip service. This is what Turning Point USA is doing for white boys. I truly don't understand how they don't see it as the exact same thing. This is identity politics for white boys. I guess that's fine, but at least own it. And it's just horseshoe theory. It just keeps on, okay? Just keeps on. And this is, I think, the most troubling thing to me is in almost every front, whether it be identity politics, whether it be economic policies, you consistently see the left and the right merging into one big ball of bad ideas and miserable people that nobody really wants to deal with. All the normal people over here in the middle, but we have nowhere to go. We're all just politically homeless, floating around, while these two groups just keep getting crazier and more out there. All right, guys, that's a wrap for this week. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Leave me a comment. Let me know your thoughts. And until next week, stay based.